Warning: the following program contains subject matter that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion advised. You're listening to Descent to Depravity, where we investigate the darkest corners of the human psyche, one chilling story at a time.
The slimy creatures of the earth that took my most precious gift from God, they need flushed down the gutter. That would even be too mild.
I hope he rots in hell. He's going to pay for his crimes one way or another, and if he feels like he's paid for him now, wait till the next life.
He's the worst individual human being I've ever seen, talked to, known, investigated. He is the worst.
Toledo entered the 1980s unaware that something malignant had already begun forming beneath the surface. The city moved through its routines, believing danger was loud, visible, reactive, believing it could recognize evil when it arrived. But the threat that emerged here didn't behave like the violence people were used to fearing. It slipped quietly into the empty spaces of night, into stalled cars, into deserted roads, into moments no one ever considered dangerous, until there was no turning back. Two men began studying opportunity like a science, learning how to take control of human lives with very little resistance and almost no trace. Before anyone realized it, reality in Toledo had started to bend. Victims vanished into the cold, the dark, and the unseen, and the city continued functioning as if nothing extraordinary was happening at all. Families kept living their lives while a series of murders slowly constructed itself in the background. The Cook brothers weren't merely committing crimes, they were rewriting what fear meant here. And by the time police finally understood what was unfolding, the damage was already embedded. Because in Toledo, evil wasn't announced. It moved quietly, patiently, like a shadow that had always been there, waiting for its moment to stop hiding. Nathaniel Cook entered the world in Mobile, Alabama in March of 1949, during an era when racial segregation still shaped daily life. When he was still an infant, the family uprooted from the South and moved north into Ohio, searching for better circumstances. Instead, the family continued to grow beyond what one household could realistically sustain. There were eventually 11 children, including Nathaniel, born in October of 1958, nearly a decade younger than Anthony. Their parents separated before stability could take hold, and their mother was left to raise all of them on her own, working as a hairdresser just to keep them afloat. The older siblings tried to help support the home, taking jobs where they could. Anthony learned early that survival required resourcefulness, and he began earning what little he could by fixing broken radios, appliances, and cars for people in their neighborhood. Growing up inside a household with that many children meant attention wasn't given freely. It had to be fought for or engineered. Emotional space was a scarce resource. Within that environment, Anthony began developing a private sense of autonomy that rejected authority rather than followed it. He learned early how to move unseen, how to bend rules quietly, and how to avoid accountability through concealment rather than confrontation. Nathaniel, almost 10 years younger, did not grow up shoulder to shoulder in the same adolescent battles. He watched rather than competed. His identity wasn't shaped by dominating siblings. It formed around adapting to the force of others. Those power dynamics established in childhood would carry directly into adulthood. One brother steering, the other falling into step behind the momentum someone else created. When Anthony reached school age in Toledo, he was placed into an all-boys institution designed for students who struggled academically and behaviorally. He never excelled there. Teachers remembered him as someone who did not apply himself, who resisted structure, and who seemed to function better outside the boundaries adults tried to impose. As he grew older, he began engaging in delinquent acts that signaled a progressive disregard for consequence: petty theft, reckless driving, and boundary-violating behavior toward young women in the neighborhood. These weren't random missteps. They were early indicators that Anthony was drifting toward a worldview where power was exerted on others rather than shared. Nathaniel's developmental track was far different. While Anthony was unraveling academically and behaviorally, Nathaniel was still a child, years behind him, absorbing the aftermath indirectly. Nathaniel was described later as quiet, socially detached, and someone who kept to himself. He did not generate chaos. He observed it from the periphery. By the mid-1960s, serious fractures inside the Cook family were no longer hidden underneath the weight of poverty and overcrowding. They were visible in the outcomes of the older children. One of Anthony's older brothers, Hayes III, was convicted of rape and sent to prison for a multi-year sentence. That event marked a new reference point inside the family. The justice system was no longer an abstract threat. It became a lived reality. Around this same period, Anthony spiraled further. He attempted suicide as a teenager by shooting himself in the chest and survived. The incident exposed a far deeper internal instability than anyone in the household had previously understood. Afterward, his adult criminal trajectory began rapidly accelerating. He was arrested for robbing a pedestrian, was eventually committed to a psychiatric facility, and was diagnosed with schizophrenia. 8 days after being released, he was arrested again, this time for assaulting and robbing a 61-year-old woman. That offense resulted in a lengthy prison sentence. While Anthony's adulthood veered into criminality and institutional control, Nathaniel's adolescence unfolded in almost the opposite direction. For long stretches, he grew up without Anthony present at all. The family relocated multiple times, from Ohio to Southern California, then back to Ohio again, where they passed through Dayton before settling in Columbus. Nathaniel assumed caretaker roles for younger sisters during some of these moves. He attended Lyndon McKinley High School but dropped out, and although he considered joining the Air Force, he never followed through. People who knew him described him as isolated, a loner, someone who existed in the background rather than driving conflict. By the time both brothers crossed into young adulthood, their developmental trajectories were already split, but structurally aligned. Anthony had learned to reject authority externally, had already embraced predatory behavior patterns, and had spent years honing a life outside accountability. Nathaniel had learned to exist in orbit around stronger personalities, rarely originating direction on his own. Investigators would later describe this dynamic bluntly. One brother generated the violence, the other followed it. Their mother's discipline, her attempts to regulate morality through religion, and the constant survival pressure inside an overcrowded home did not produce empathy or restraint. Instead, it produced two different psychological outcomes rooted in the same polluted soil. A dominant manipulator who already lived outside social law, and a passive companion conditioned to support the force of someone else's decisions. Childhood did not cause their future crimes, but childhood formed the structure that made those adult crimes possible. When their paths reconverged, the outcome was no longer theoretical. It would become the foundation of a serial predation system that Toledo never recognized until it was far too late. Anthony made parole in mid-1973. In December of 1973, Toledo was buried under winter weather. Roads were icy, vehicles were trapped in snowbanks across the city, and nighttime movement slowed into pockets of isolation. Late that night, 21-year-old Vicki Lynn Small, a University of Toledo graduate, physically confident and trained in martial arts, became stranded near the intersection of Cherry and Mark Street when her friend's car got stuck. Two unidentified men approached and helped push the vehicle free. Vicki believed they were good-hearted strangers trying to help during a rough winter night. When she accepted a short ride, only a block from her apartment, she instead vanished into Anthony Cook's control. It was later determined that Anthony was one of the men who left with her. The identity of the other man has never been confirmed, and no evidence ever tied anyone else to her murder. Anthony did not take her home. He drove her into Ottawa Park, a secluded stretch of wooded ground in central Toledo, where the noise of the city seemed to fall away. There, the situation turned violent. Vicki was assaulted, beaten, and then shot repeatedly, multiple rounds striking both her head and chest. Her body was abandoned near the old golf club unit along Bancroft Street and Parkside Boulevard, where a patrolling officer later discovered her lying in the cold, dark hours before sunrise. Her death occurred years before the Cook brothers' known series began, but it revealed the threshold Anthony had already crossed internally. Investigators interviewed nearly 100 persons of interest. Multiple .25 caliber pistols were seized and test-fired, but none matched the ballistic evidence. The case stalled and her killer walked free. In the following years, Anthony continued violent behavior. In 1974, he robbed 2 people at gunpoint and was sent back to prison. When he was released again in 1979, he attempted to blend into normal life, working scrap hauling and even marrying a school teacher. Around that same time, Nathaniel returned to his orbit. Nathaniel had no violent history, only traffic violations. But the reformation of their childhood dynamic aligned them again. Anthony had already shown he was capable of lethal violence. When the brothers were both back in proximity and 1980 arrived, the murders that followed were no longer a possibility. They were inevitable. Around 12:30 a.m., while Thomas Gordon and 18-year-old Sandra Podgorski sat inside their parked vehicle in the 900 block of Utica Street in North Toledo, Anthony and Nathaniel approached without warning. One of them smashed the passenger side window with a brick, collapsing the glass inward instantly. They brandished a firearm and forced both Thomas and Sandra out of the passenger space and into the rear of the vehicle under direct threat. Nothing about this was chaotic. It was controlled, efficient, practiced, like they've done it before. Thomas and Sandra were then driven out toward western Lucas County, deep into the rural dark, far from city sound, far from immediate rescue. The car left pavement and rolled off Robb Road, roughly 20 feet away from the roadway, where tree lines absorbed headlights and sound. Once there, the offenders separated control from escape. Thomas became the containment liability. Sandra became the violence target. And both offenders moved with a confidence that suggested anticipation rather than reaction. Thomas tried to resist. He tried to escape. And that attempt sealed what came next. When Thomas attempted to flee in that isolated field off Robb Road, he was lit up by gunfire. Investigators later determined he was struck with multiple round Enya .22 caliber handgun. He never made it out of that rural darkness alive. Anthony and Nathaniel viciously raped Sandra. Afterwards, she was repeatedly stabbed in the face and chest area with an ice pick. Her injuries were extensive and severe. In order to survive, she pretended to be lifeless. Under the assumption Sandra was dead, they left her in the back seat of the car and directed their attention back to Thomas. Thomas's body was then forced into the trunk space of the vehicle, confined in the same car he had been sitting peacefully inside just hours prior. When the offenders fled, the vehicle remained abandoned, concealed partially off the road, hidden by distance and darkness. That same car was discovered hours later, and inside the trunk, police found Thomas's body. Sandra, barely clinging to consciousness, eventually pulled herself back out into the night and staggered toward the nearest residence on Clay Street. Drenched in pain and shock, she was able to tell police what had happened and where her boyfriend's body was, before being transported to Riverside Hospital for emergency treatment. The Cooks' next victim after Mr. Gordon and his girlfriend was Connie Sue Thompson, 19, who was hitchhiking on Cherry Street near St. Vincent Medical Center on January 17, 1981, when she was picked up by the brothers. They drove her to western Lucas County, where she was assaulted, stabbed over 60 times, then strangled. Her body was discovered in a culvert under a road, police said. Nathaniel later admitted he strangled Connie Sue Thompson with a wire around her neck. January 28, 1981. It is winter in Toledo, the same season where multiple threads of violence were already starting to form in silence. On this night, Cheryl Bartlett and her boyfriend Arnold Coates were walking near Field and Segur. Nothing about where they were or what they were doing suggested danger should have been waiting for them. But the Cook brothers operated inside ordinary space. They turned regular sidewalks, familiar intersections, and normal life into hunting ground. Nathaniel Cook approached first, dressed in green army-style clothing, his approach casual enough to not immediately trigger alarm. He spoke to them, closing distance slowly, guiding them into an alley. Anthony was waiting deeper inside the dark structure, like it was rehearsed, like it had been done before. The couple was suddenly surrounded, ordered to pull their hats down so they couldn't see clearly, and forced toward an abandoned garage. The shift from public street to enclosed isolation happened in seconds. Inside that greasy, junk-stained garage, The psychological terror was as damaging as the physical threat. Anthony raised a .22 caliber revolver toward Coates's head and ordered him to hold Cheryl as tight as he could, telling them it could be the last time they would ever hold each other. Cheryl later remembered the quote precisely. Seconds later, the gun fired. Miraculously, the bullet did not strike Arnold, but Cheryl was shot in the back. The assault that followed was prolonged, degrading, and devastating. Cheryl was subjected to sexual violence while both brothers laughed, whispered, and verbally degraded her, calling her demeaning racial slurs while Arnold watched. Their cruelty wasn't impulsive, it was controlled, targeted, designed to dominate and psychologically destroy. Somehow, Cheryl survived. Arnold survived. They lived through an attack that almost no one else did. At the time, investigators could not convert the evidence they had into charges that would stand. The case was not fully prosecutable on its own, but Cheryl's testimony, preserved in memory for 2 decades, became part of the connective tissue that would later help prosecutors understand the full behavioral pattern and timeline of Anthony Cook and Nathaniel Cook. February 1981. Dawn Renee Bax was a 12-year-old 7th grader at Gesu School, a quiet child who spent her weekends like most kids her age, laughing with friends, eating pizza, and trying to stretch childhood a little longer. On the afternoon she disappeared. She and 2 friends had been at Fat Daryl's, a pizza parlor and entertainment center at 3310 Secor Road. When plans for a ride home fell through, the girls started walking. At 1:03 p.m., Dawn was last seen at 1718 Perth Street, heading southbound on Seeker Road after she separated from her friends. She never made it home. Dawn was reported missing, and for days there were only questions. No witnesses, no sightings, just a child who had vanished somewhere between a restaurant and her front door. The truth would come from the Cook brothers. Anthony Cook was the first to approach her, luring the 12-year-old into his car. Not long after, his brother Nathaniel joined him. Together they drove Dawn to an abandoned building on Collingwood Boulevard, the former State Theater, a place that had once held crowds, laughter, lights. Now it was silent, gutted, and cold. Inside its basement, the brothers beat and tortured the innocent girl for hours. At some point that night, the violence escalated into murder. Dawn's skull and facial bones were crushed, struck repeatedly with a cement block. When it was over, the brothers left her body on the basement floor and walked away. For days, no one knew where she was, until a phone call came in. On Wednesday evening at 7:56 p.m., Toledo Police Dispatch received a call from a man who refused to give his name. His voice was flat, expressionless. "I think there's a body in the basement of the State Theater." The officer asked for his information. He refused. Asked how he knew a body was there, he refused again, stating he didn't want to be involved. "Just take my word for it," he said, and hung up. Police followed the tip anyway. Officers reached the abandoned theater at 2460 Collingwood Boulevard and found a rear entrance to the basement. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, settling on the still form of a young girl lying about 30 feet from the stairs. Dawn was fully clothed, her body frozen from the February cold. There was blood, not only near her body, but splattered and smeared in a smaller adjacent room, where a thick layer of dust had been disturbed. A table showed signs of struggle. The scene told the story the girl could not. Dr. Harry Minery, the Lucas County coroner, examined the body. The freezing temperature had preserved her to the point where the exact time of death couldn't be determined. But the cause was unmistakable. Her skull and face had been crushed by a cement block. On the night of March 27, 1981, 2 21-year-old grocery store employees, Denise Siatkowski and Scott Moulton, were talking inside Denise's car in the parking lot of the Fountain Circle Apartments in Oregon, Ohio. They were co-workers at the Center Supermarket on Navarre Avenue. Well known there, well liked there, seen every day as normal young adults whose futures were assumed to unfold slowly and sensibly. That night, they left work around 6 p.m. after receiving their paychecks. Co-workers believed they were supposed to meet additional employees at a nearby restaurant later, but they never arrived. Cook approached them alone, armed with a .22 caliber revolver. He forced himself into the moment without theatrics. He ordered both victims to drive to an isolated location. There, He bound Scott with his own belt, forced him into the trunk, and separated Denise from any possible protection. She was assaulted. Afterward, he forced her into the trunk with Scott. Then came the execution. Cook emptied his revolver into the confined darkness of that trunk, firing into both of them repeatedly. He then drove the vehicle back to Fountain Circle, leaving the silent car sitting at the same residential complex where the night had started. Untouched, unnoticed, undisturbed, for days. It wasn't until a week later, on April 3, 1981, that police discovered Scott and Denise's bodies inside the trunk. Dr. Harry McNeary, Lucas County coroner, later confirmed both had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber revolver, consistent with Cook's firearm. Scott had been shot once in the chest and 3 times in the head. Denise had been shot 5 times in the head. People who worked with them described both victims as outstanding kids, the kind of young adults who never caused friction, who laughed with coworkers, who were part of the family culture inside that store. Employees struggled to reconcile the brutality of the crime with who they knew these victims to be. One employee said simply, "We just want to get our hands on whoever did it." Stacy Lynn Balonek, 20, and Daryl Cole, 21, were last seen alive in the early hours of August 2, 1981, in the Point Place neighborhood of Toledo. They had been at the home of Stacy's sister and brother-in-law, leaving around 2 a.m. with the intention of going back to Stacy's Doyle Street residence. They never arrived. By the time the sun rose, the couple had vanished into the same silent vacuum Anthony repeatedly exploited, the transitional space between one safe location and the next. When Stacy and Daryl did not return home, the alarm inside their families began immediately. Stacy's father told police he woke the next morning and noticed the porch light, the one he always left on for her, was still burning hours later. No footsteps, no door, no return. That single detail became the signal that something had ruptured. On August 3, 1981, relatives located Daryl Cole's tan and brown 1979 Pontiac Grand Prix sitting on Woodward Avenue in North Toledo, only a few blocks from Stacy's own neighborhood. The underside of the vehicle was covered in mud. The car was towed to the safety building garage. Inside the trunk, investigators found both victims, beaten to death and left sealed inside the dark, confined space where their final moments had occurred. The coroner later confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma. Police collected several baseball bats found inside the trunk and speculated that at least one had been used during the killings. There was no missing property from the car, no robbery motive, no escape attempt. The scene where Stacy and Daryl were actually attacked wasn't discovered until days later, and it only surfaced because a uniformed sergeant refused to rely solely on theory. Acting on nothing more than a hunch, Sergeant Michael Schroeder exited his patrol car in the Buckeye Basin region of North Toledo and searched on foot. What he found was not random debris. It was the physical residue of violence. A single shoe lay in the thick underbrush. Investigators compared it to a photograph distributed within the department, showing the pair of shoes Stacy Balonek was believed to have been wearing the night she disappeared. It matched. Detectives flooded the area. They recovered blood, a woman's gold necklace, and even a tooth. Physical markers of proximity and harm. The Buckeye Basin terrain was described as desolate, heavily overgrown and isolated. Exactly the type of environment Cook repeatedly exploited. There, away from witnesses and street traffic, the homicide had been committed. Once the couple was incapacitated, their bodies were transported inside their own vehicle and locked into the trunk as if he was sealing away evidence, but also sealing away their identities, their voices, their futures. September 18, 1981. Real estate developer Peter Sawicki, 43, spent that night like any other father protecting normalcy. His daughter Leslie was out with her boyfriend Todd Sabo, 21. They returned to their van near the 4100 block of North Terrace View Drive shortly after 12:20 a.m. What none of them knew was that Anthony Cook had already inserted himself into proximity, watching movement, waiting for the moment where routine dissolved into vulnerability. Anthony confronted both Todd and Leslie with a gun. The man forced Mr. Sabo out of the van and tied his arms and legs, and Leslie was forced to the rear of the vehicle, where Anthony disclosed to her that he was going to rape her. Todd somehow broke free and began fighting with Anthony. Leslie fled to an apartment building, owned by her father, at 4121 North Terrace View, where she pounded on doors until an unidentified second-floor tenant allowed her to call her father. Peter, after being called by his daughter for help, arrived at the scene and entered the struggle without hesitation. A father responding to a crisis with zero regard for his own safety. Inside that cramped corridor of metal, winter air, and panic, the fight turned catastrophic within seconds. During the struggle, Todd managed to briefly take the gun from Anthony. That moment should have been the shift, the reversal, the point where the offender retreats. But Anthony regained control of the weapon. At point-blank range, he fired. Peter Sawicki was shot in the throat and killed almost instantly, collapsing inside the same residential street where he had lived his normal life only minutes earlier. Todd Sabo was also shot, struck in the neck and right shoulder, but survived the attack long enough for police and medical personnel to reach him. Todd would later provide critical information while hospitalized. Anthony fled into the dark, leaving a father dead, a young man gravely wounded, and a daughter who would live with the memory of watching her father step into harm to protect her. Investigators recovered latent fingerprints from the Peter Sawicki murder scene, and those prints were conclusively matched to Anthony Cook. That forensic hit immediately focused the investigation on him. The case strengthened even further when Ernest Kennard, a friend of Cook's, told detectives that Anthony had admitted to killing Sawicki, arrived afterward with a visibly swollen jaw from the struggle, and asked Kennard to hide his gun for him. With both physical evidence and a direct verbal admission pointing to the same suspect, detectives moved decisively. On October 15, 1981, Anthony Cook, then a 32-year-old truck driver, was taken into custody. Anthony Cook was convicted in connection with the fatal shooting of real estate developer Peter Sawicki, who was killed in a parking lot on Terrace View Drive North. A Lucas County jury found Cook guilty after prosecutors presented testimony from Sawicki's daughter, Leslie, and her boyfriend, Todd Sabo, who stated Cook robbed them at gunpoint for $5 and then attempted to rape Leslie. When Sawicki arrived moments later to help his daughter, a violent struggle broke out, and Cook shot both men. Judge Reno Riley sentenced Anthony Cook to 20 years to life, the maximum penalty permitted under Ohio law. The sentence included 15 years to life for the murder, plus additional stacked terms for attempted murder, aggravated robbery, and attempted rape. Cook showed no emotion as the sentence was read, and he would not be eligible for parole for at least 12 years and 8 months. By the fall of 1997, more than a decade and a half had passed since the Cook homicides went cold. Some of the murders they committed in the early 1980s had been sitting unresolved for nearly 15 to 17 years. During that period, DNA technology didn't exist at the level needed to prove what detectives already suspected. Then an assistant prosecutor, Mrs. Bates, returned from a Cleveland conference where the Sam Shepard wrongful imprisonment case and new forensic methods were being discussed. She realized DNA could now be used against the Cooks in a way that wasn't possible when the killings first occurred. Detective Steve Forrester of Toledo Police revived the old files. A search warrant was issued, and the brothers' blood samples were seized. DNA testing confirmed they had raped the girlfriend of murder victim Mr. Gordon. The statute of limitations had expired on the rape and kidnapping charges, but the DNA tie gave prosecutors the foothold they needed. They were able to charge both Anthony and Nathaniel Cook with aggravated murder, reopening the case files that had been dormant since the early 1980s. More than 25 years after their earliest murders, prosecutors in Lucas County struck a deal with Anthony and Nathaniel Cook. Both brothers agreed to plead guilty to the 1980 kidnapping and aggravated murder of 24-year-old Tom Gordon, along with the attempted aggravated murder and kidnapping of Gordon's 18-year-old girlfriend. In return, they provided details about the 7 additional homicides from the early 1980s, killings neither investigators nor the victims' families ever expected to see solved. As part of the agreement, no additional charges would be filed for any other cases outside of the 1980 homicide they pleaded to. Anthony Cook, then 51, was sentenced to 15 years to life for the aggravated murder of Tom Gordon, on top of the 15 years to life sentence he was already serving for the 1981 murder of Ottawa Hills realtor Peter Sawicki. Nathaniel Cook, age 42, received 21 to 75 years for the attempted murder of Gordon's girlfriend and the 2 kidnapping counts, with his deal calling for parole eligibility on February 13, 2018. He was paroled and released from prison on August 10, 2018, and today walks a free man. In the end, this story isn't about Anthony and Nathaniel Cook. It's about the people whose lives they shattered. The innocent whose lives were cut short. The families who waited decades for answers and suffer without their loved ones. The Cook brothers operated without empathy, without remorse, without conscience. They hunted human beings for their own gratification, and they believed time, fear, and silence would bury their crimes forever. That is evil. That is what true depravity looks like. But the victims didn't disappear. Their names stayed, their cases stayed, and the investigators and prosecutors who refused to forget them forced accountability, even 20 years later.